Thanks for watching and liking the video. She waited until I sat down before she started. Not because she needed permission, but because she wanted my full attention. She placed her phone on the table face down, folded her hands the way she does in meetings, and spoke evenly, like she was about to explain a strategy that had already been approved. She said our marriage wasn't the same anymore. She said she developed an emotional connection with Ethan. She was careful with the words, pronouncing each one slowly, making sure nothing sounded messy. She said it wasn't an affair. She said it was a partnership, something creative, something that made her feel alive again. Then she told me I had two options. I could accept a new format for our marriage, one where intimacy wasn't expected and closeness happened when it felt right for her. Or I could step aside quietly and give her space to figure out what she needed next. The dishwasher clicked as it switched cycles. Outside, a car passed, headlights sliding across the kitchen wall. She watched my face closely, waiting for a reaction she could work with. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I let her finish. When I told her neither option worked for me, she blinked, genuinely surprised. She said those were the only realistic choices. She said this was what honesty looked like. She said adults adapted. I pushed my chair back, stood up, and told her there was a third option. She asked what I meant. I picked up my keys and walked out, leaving her sitting there with both hands still folded, already planning a conversation that was about to stop existing. 3 days later, during a client presentation at her office, someone handed her an envelope with her name on it. By the time her phone started ringing, my answer was already moving through the system. The marriage didn't crack in one moment. It thinned out slowly, like something stretched too far and never allowed to snap back. For the last 11 months, Ethan's name lived in our house more than I did. She brought him up at dinner, casually, between bites, talking about how he framed ideas, how he pushed clients, how conversations with him never felt small. She said he understood her creatively. She said it with a softness she no longer used with me. When I asked what she thought about something unrelated, she brushed it aside and said she'd already talked it through at work. When I suggested we spend an evening together, she checked her calendar without looking at me and said there was a late session. When I suggested a weekend away, she sighed and said momentum mattered right now. She started coming home wired, dropping her bag by the door and opening her laptop before taking off her coat. She kissed my cheek quickly, distracted, already halfway back into whatever conversation she'd left. At night, she lay beside me scrolling, smiling at her screen, turning it slightly away without realizing she was doing it. Her phone stopped resting face up. It stayed face down on the table, on the couch, on the nightstand. Passwords changed. Notifications went quiet. When it buzzed, she glanced at it and slid it into her pocket. Weekends turned into strategy offsites. She came back energized and distant, talking fast, already planning the next thing. I stood in the doorway watching her unpack, waiting for her to look up and notice me standing there. Most of the time, she didn't. By the time she started saying my name out loud again, it sounded rehearsed. Careful, like she was practicing how to explain me to someone else. 2 weeks before the conversation in the kitchen, I drove to her office late at night because she said she'd be done by 9 and hadn't answered my last message. The parking garage was almost empty, the kind of quiet that made footsteps echo longer than they should. I rode the elevator up alone, watching the numbers climb, rehearsing nothing, expecting nothing. Most of the floor was dark. Desks were cleared, chairs pushed in, half-empty coffee cups abandoned near keyboards. Only one space was still lit, the conference room at the corner with the glass walls that looked out over the city. I slowed before I reached it, stopping in the shadow of the hallway where the light didn't quite spill. She was sitting on the edge of the table, feet off the ground, leaning back on her hands. Ethan stood close enough that there was no space left to misunderstand. His hands rested on her hips with an ease that came from repetition, not impulse. She laughed, the same laugh she used when she felt admired, head tipping back, shoulders loose. He said something I couldn't hear, and she reached for him, fingers curling at the back of his neck, pulling him closer instead of away. There was no urgency in the room. No rush. No hesitation. It looked practiced. I didn't step forward. I didn't interrupt. I turned around and walked back the way I'd come, past empty desks and dark screens, down the elevator, out into the garage. When she came home later, she said traffic was bad and asked if I'd eaten. I said I couldn't get through the city. She nodded without looking up from her phone and kept scrolling. The next morning, she talked about deadlines and meetings like the night before had never happened. I let her. After she gave me the ultimatum, the house didn't explode into arguments the way people expect it to. It settled into something quieter and heavier. She moved through the rooms like the conversation had already ended in her favor, making coffee the next morning, answering emails at the counter, talking about deliverables as if nothing fragile had been placed on the table the night before. When she mentioned Ethan again, it was casual, almost reassuring. She said he respected boundaries. She said he understood how complicated things were. She said I was handling this better than she expected. Each sentence landed softly, designed not to provoke, designed to keep me where she'd placed me. I told her I needed a few days to think. She nodded, visibly relieved, and went back to her calendar. Meetings filled the screen. Late nights blocked out. A weekend marked unavailable. She kissed my cheek before leaving for work and said she appreciated my maturity. That same morning, I walked into a low-rise building downtown and gave my name at the front desk. The office smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The attorney listened while I described the office at night, the timing, the charges on her card that weren't work expenses. He didn't react when I mentioned Ethan. He just wrote things down and asked for dates. When I finished, he stacked the papers neatly and said my position was strong. 2 days later, I signed everything he put in front of me. I didn't rehearse a speech. I didn't wait for the right moment. A courier delivered the documents to her office on Friday afternoon. Time to arrive while she was standing in front of a screen explaining trust and alignment to a room full of people. I was back at my desk when she opened the envelope, staring at a future she hadn't included in her options. My phone started vibrating before the courier had even made it back to the elevator. I was sitting at my desk, screens open, pretending to read an email I wasn't processing. The first call rang out. The second came a few seconds later. On the third, I answered. Her voice was unsteady, rushed, stripped of the polish she usually kept for difficult conversations. She asked if I was serious. She asked why I would do this at her office, in front of her team, in the middle of a presentation. She said we had agreed to talk first. She said this wasn't how adults handled things. I told her she was the one who framed the choices. I reminded her she said I could accept the new format or step aside. I said I chose divorce, officially, with documents instead of discussions. She tried to slow the moment down. She said I misunderstood what she meant. She said she was trying to be honest with me before things got messy. She said Ethan was just a collaborator and that I was reacting too fast. I told her honesty didn't get to cause consequences. Then I ended the call. That evening, while I was still at work, a long message came through. She wrote about humiliation, about leadership pulling her aside, about people whispering. She wrote that Ethan was shocked, that the timing had blindsided him, that this would follow her. I read it once, sitting in my car before driving home. Then I blocked her number, her email, and every shared account that still gave her access to me. When I got home, the house was quiet. Her laptop sat open on the counter, slides frozen mid-transition. I closed it without looking. She came back late. She stood in the hallway for a moment, holding her phone like it might explain something for her, then walked past the guest room without knocking. The awareness didn't arrive all at once. It started with silence where control used to be. I moved out a week later, early in the morning, while the street was still quiet and the house felt like it was holding its breath. I didn't rush. I packed clothes from the closet, my work laptop, a few chargers, and the things I used every day without thinking. I left the rest where it was. The framed photos stayed on the walls. Her books stayed on the shelves. The house didn't need to look erased. It just needed to stop being mine. The new apartment was smaller and closer to my office. White walls, bare counters, no history baked into the rooms. I set up my desk that same night and logged into work like it was any other weekday. Meetings started. Reports went out. No one asked questions. At her agency, questions didn't stop. A few days after I moved, a message came through from someone I barely knew. Emily, a junior designer I'd met once or twice at holiday parties. She said she was sorry to reach out like this, but she thought I should know what happened after the presentation. She wrote that when the meeting ended and people started packing up, Ethan walked out of the room without saying a word to my wife. He didn't look back. He didn't wait for her. He didn't text her afterward. For 3 days, he avoided her entirely. Meetings were rescheduled. Hallway conversations ended abruptly when she approached. When they finally spoke, it wasn't in the office. Emily said he told her the situation had become too visible, that leadership was uncomfortable, that he needed to think about his future. He said it calmly, professionally. Emily wrote that my wife locked herself in the restroom afterward and cried quietly, trying not to draw attention. I stared at the message for a long moment, then locked my phone and set it face down on the table. The shift wasn't dramatic. It showed up in empty evenings, blocked numbers, and rooms that stopped rearranging themselves around her presence. I had lunch with Dan the following week, the same place near our office where we'd eaten 100 times before without ever talking about anything personal. He waited until our plates were on the table before saying anything, watching me the way people do when they already know the answer but want to hear it anyway. He said he'd heard I'd moved out. Not as a question, just a statement. He said most people would have tried to talk their way back into control, even when it was already gone. He said I didn't do that. I shrugged and kept eating. I told him I wasn't interested in choosing between options that were designed to leave me smaller than I started. He nodded once, like that was enough explanation, and didn't push it further. We finished lunch, paid separately, and went back to work. No follow-up. No advice. The conversation stayed exactly where it needed to. A week later, while I was finishing up a report, a message from Dan popped up on my screen. There was no text with it, just a link. It led to the agency's LinkedIn page. A clean announcement, polished photos, the kind of post that gets shared without anyone reading past the headline. Ethan had been promoted and transferred to the New York office. In the first image, he stood in front of glass towers, smiling the way people do when they think the timing worked out in their favor. I scrolled. In the second photo, Emily stood beside him. New title, new city. Her name placed carefully under his, like this was always where she was supposed to land. I closed the page and saved the link without thinking about why. That night, I went through the last box I hadn't unpacked and found an old external drive we'd shared years ago. I wiped it, dropped it in a recycling bin on my way out, and didn't look back. The support didn't come with speeches. It came in small confirmations that I wasn't the only one seeing what was happening. I saw her again a little over a month later, outside the courthouse on a gray morning that made the building look heavier than it already was. She was standing near the steps with a folder pressed to her chest, shifting her weight from one foot to the other like she didn't know where to put herself. No coworkers. No phone call in progress. Just her, waiting. When she noticed me, her face changed in a way I hadn't seen before. Less controlled, more exposed, like she hadn't prepared the right version of herself for this moment. Inside, everything moved quickly. Names confirmed. Papers slid across the desk. Pens passed back and forth. The clerk explained the process without looking at either of us. When it was done, the folder was thinner, lighter, no longer something she could rearrange with words. We walked out separately, but stopped a few steps apart. She turned first. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't wanted things to end like this. She said Ethan wasn't who she thought he was. Her voice dropped when she said his name, like it didn't carry the same weight anymore. She asked if there was any chance we could slow down, talk, figure out what this all meant. I took my phone out, opened the link Dan had sent me weeks earlier, and held it where she could see the screen. Ethan stood in front of a skyline in New York. Emily stood next to him, smiling, her new title printed neatly beneath her name. She stared at it longer than she needed to. Then she asked how old Emily was, already knowing the answer. When she said the number out loud, it sounded wrong in her own mouth. I put the phone away and told her we were done. She stayed there with the folder still clutched in her hands, eyes unfocused, like she was trying to place herself in a story that had moved on without her. I walked past her toward the exit. She didn't follow. The guard held the door open for me. She remained on the steps, holding papers that no longer gave her any say in what happened next. A month after the divorce was finalized, an email came in late at night from an address I didn't recognize right away. I opened it sitting at the small table in my apartment, half a plate of cold food pushed aside, the room lit by a single lamp. It was Emily. She didn't ease into it. She said she wanted me to know the truth because no one else ever seemed to say it out loud. She wrote that Ethan had been seeing both of them at the same time for months. She wrote that it started during the same strategy offsite my wife had gone to, the one she came back from glowing and distant. Emily described the weekend plainly. Saturday night with my wife. Sunday night with her. 2 hotel rooms. 2 versions of the same explanation about work running late. She wrote that both of them believed they were different. Both of them believed they were chosen. When the divorce papers were delivered publicly, the overlap stopped being invisible. Leadership started asking questions. Meetings shifted. Conversations moved into hallways and then stopped altogether. Ethan made his decision fast. He took the transfer to New York. He took Emily with him. Younger. No marriage. No public mess attached to her name yet. My ex stayed at the agency. Same desk. Same role. No Ethan. No future he'd promised. No one rearranging schedules to protect her anymore. Emily ended the message by saying she'd quit 2 weeks after the transfer. Packed her desk. Walked out. She said seeing how cleanly I left showed her she didn't have to stay. I replied once, wished her luck, and closed the thread. Nothing else followed. The damage finished spreading without me in the room. A few weeks later, I saw her again without planning to. I was walking past a cafe near our old neighborhood, the kind of place she used to like because people there recognized her. She stood outside by herself, phone in her hand, scrolling without typing, stepping aside every time someone came too close. The posture was different. Shoulders pulled in, head down, like she didn't want to be noticed and didn't know what to do with that feeling yet. She didn't see me. I crossed the street when the light changed and kept walking. That night, in my apartment, I cooked dinner and ate standing at the counter because I hadn't bought a table yet. I washed the plate, dried it, and put it away. My phone lay face up beside the sink. It didn't light up. The next morning at work, my badge opened the door on the first try. Meetings ran on schedule. No one asked how I was doing. No one needed an explanation. Later that week, a mutual contact mentioned she was still at the agency. Same role, different standing. People no longer waited for her to speak. Projects moved forward without looping her in. The room didn't pause for her the way it used to. I never reached out. Neither did she. One evening, I went through my phone and deleted the last thread with her name on it. No rereading. No hesitation. Just a swipe and confirmation. The choices she gave me had been designed to keep her at the center of everything. I didn't pick either one. I walked away while she was still explaining the rules, and by the time she realized the game was over, she was standing alone, holding options that no longer belonged to her. Thanks for staying till the end. What's your take on this story? Let me know in the comments. Subscribe. More true and hidden stories are coming soon.